afternoon, everybody. Okay, why don't we go ahead and get started? I want to make the most of our time with our distinguished guest. I'm Amy Ziegert. I know most of you, but not all of you. I am delighted to be the co-chair of, with John Taylor, the Technology, Economics, and Governance Working Group here at the Hoover Institution. I want to thank all of you for coming, and a special thanks to Professor Jeffrey Sonnenfeld from Yale, who's going to be our speaker today. Let me just say at the outset, as we know, just about an hour ago, Queen Elizabeth passed away in the UK. It's quite a milestone, the longest reigning monarch, a woman who ascended the throne in 1952. So we're going to be talking about a lot of tectonic geopolitical shifts today, and I just wanted to acknowledge that. I think Jeff's going to talk a little bit about that as well. Let me introduce Jeff. It's really a pleasure and an honor. We're not going to say how long we've known each other for, right, Jeff? That was part of the drug deal for this event. He is the Senior Associate Dean for Leadership Studies and the Lester Crown Professor in the Practice of Management at Yale University. He is also the founder and president of the Chief Executive Leadership Institute, which is a nonprofit educational and research institute focused on CEO leadership and corporate governance. Before coming to Yale, Jeff was on the faculty at the Emory Business School for a decade, and before that, he was on the faculty at Harvard Business School for a decade. And I had the great fortune of getting to meet Jeff when he was at Harvard and I was an undergraduate. We're not saying what year that was, but I will say he was one of those cherished professors that students always remember. A visionary and a dynamo back then, and he dedicated himself to mentoring others, whether it was CEOs or wayward undergraduates, as the case may be. So it's a special treat for me to have him here today. Business Week has listed him as one of the world's 10 most influential business school professors. He's authored 8 books and is widely published in leading academic journals. Most recently, he has led a team at Yale doing remarkable work measuring the retreat of private sector businesses from Russia after the invasion of Ukraine. And he's also been at the leading edge of debunking many media myths about the economic impact of sanctions and additional business retreats on Russia's economy. It's an extraordinary effort that is cataloging and catalyzing action in the private sector at this geopolitical moment. So Jeff, many thanks for taking time to join us today. I'm going to turn it over to you.
Amy, thank you very much for that wonderful introduction, which I somehow foolishly was interrupting. Who would ever want to preempt that? I'll tell you who would. Everybody else who had to listen to it other than me. With the gallery of Zoom faces I could see before me, I saw that by the time you got to the 4th or 5th page, I felt a little guilty having sent you most of that content. I probably should have edited back a little bit. Thank you for those kind remarks. Maybe somebody who should have heard it was my boss or my wife. So if there's I see we signed off a recording on this, so I'll send it there. But on those introductions, probably by the 4th page, I even started to slightly dislike myself a bit at that point. But the one thing that you didn't mention is, of course, a group that is this savvy could do the arithmetic, and you gave the dates that I had all those different positions, so somebody could tally them up and realize, as you said, when we knew each other. That takes us fairly far back. And what we had going there then, which speaks to today's headlines, is notable. And that is, as you said, I am the Lester Crown Professor. Of course, Lester Crown, you know, is the legendary force behind Aspen Institute and General Dynamics and many enterprises and global causes. And he's still alive, as he is a couple of years older than now the late Queen. But in my line of work, and given the positions of many of you, being called a crown professor, if you didn't know the Lester Crown family, thinks it sounds, crown professor sounds very regal, and the leadership like a throne for a crown chair. But here we did have such sad news on a regal front. And what's interesting then too is as a woman leader that took office so young at age 26. Again, we won't say when it was with Amy, but it was younger than that. That Amy had the idea to launch something that you would have thought some enterprising students would have done at the at Harvard long ago, and that was to create the first Harvard Radcliffe Women's Leadership Forum. And it was bringing together people across fields. I got to know her just because, if you can imagine, at that time, the handful of women we had on the faculty at the Harvard Business School were afraid of being stigmatized, typecast, if they were seen as a champion of a feminist cause. And this was not particularly a feminist cause. It was trying to understand leadership and different genders and issues and across sectors and nonpartisan, of course, and everything. And then across the Charles River, of course, in psychology, social relations, government department, people thought, what, we don't want anything to do with business. That's evil and venal and things. So by default, I kind of wound up as a faculty chair of this great initiative, which we won't say, since I had to make this pledge to not give the number of years. It's still thrived since. And it's just a reminder that Amy, many of her own books ago, has really been on this theme of leadership. And leadership, just in looking at the gender piece for a minute. Imagine mourning your own dad and being a monarch, stepping in at age 26, as the Queen did. There are a lot of, I think, paradoxes. Obviously, a principled person, the symbolic head of state. Through some of you on this call could actually calibrate it. I think it's 15 British governments. It could be more, but I think it's only 15. And ironically, this can't be right, but I think it's, as I count up the presidents that I remember, because she took office when I was just before I was born. So I was kind of dating myself. Is about 15 U.S. presidents too, but conferring legitimacy just 2 years ago at a time for a new prime minister, and of course for a woman. It's so in some ways ironic and poignant that it's enough to make the heretics almost religious over this. That it's just, the poignancy is quite powerful. Most traveled monarch, of course, in history, never complaining of her duties, and few of us would want to do this, greeting her constituents with warmth and pushing the family, which sometimes, as we know, it was rocky at times, to get out there and mix with people beyond the walls of Buckingham Palace. I don't know, and there are a few people on this call, almost as old as I am, that we don't remember any faux pas, any miscues. Unfortunately, her descendants have not been so faultless in their public steps, but it was remarkable. And it wasn't that her conservatism or caution kept her from it. She just put a lot of deliberate thought into when she would engage, and she did champion many causes over that 70-year reign. You know, we don't usually think of somebody who would have held office for 70 years at age 96 as a premature passing. I think some of the grief is a sadness ourselves that we feel with the continuity of leadership and stability that she represented in a lot of good ways. Our parents, our grandparents, they knew no other British monarch. And of course, they're largely sobbing in the UK, no matter how they felt about the monarchy per se. As a revered head of state, she was a reminder of, as again, people on this call, but generally in the media, don't understand the cartoonish cliches of Machiavelli, which he never quite said a leader is respected or admired. He actually said, basically, it's a forcelled opportunity, and you can be high on both and low on both, and high on one and low on the other, so that there is a necessary trade-off between being loved and respected. But that's the way it's largely received, and it's, of course, the way President Putin, who we will talk about, Amy, largely sees it as being, revered rather, feared rather than loved, and as a bridge of continuity from our historic past, with direct personal relationships with such, World War I titans as Winston Churchill and FDR. Now, she wasn't yet quite in office then, but she did know them. She paradoxically was a pillar of moral traditional values, and yet also a bridge to a modern world with major changes that had to be done, with regal identity balanced off with a certain personal humility. Her values, the traditional ones, of course, were integrity and humility and patriotism. The bonds across the Atlantic Ocean are so important to us, but a celebration of science at a time where who would have thought we'd need to be reminded of that. But as a change agent, she welcomed embrace of racial diversity, other religions, ethnicities, very good for Islamic newcomers into Britain, embracing ultimately the commoner spouses for her children and grandchildren. We know that led to a lot of headlines along the way. And finally, just, of course, we've had these moments of dread in our own lives. We imagine our parents passing and things like that. And she was about the age of my mom. And so it rings bells for some of us personally about that lost, sort of, as Tom Brokaw later labeled, the great generation. She's one of a last of that great era. But it was a unique leadership task that she performed with unique diligence and dignity, and a reminder of what we're going to wrestle with shortly today, I think, Amy, and this is my final comment, of the inextricably intertwined nature of leadership, that it is inextricably intertwined with substance and symbolism. And a lot of times we are so focused so hard on the substance, we think that the symbolism is trivial. But I think there's a lot to celebrate there. So thank you for letting me tell you what you guys know so often. And John, did I already bore you to tears? I was just thinking, you really didn't probably expect me to go down this path, but I thought that you'll be talking about these things a lot yourselves and saying them a lot more eloquent yourselves. So please put this in the category of just some trigger thoughts for your own more expert reflections on political leadership.
Jeff, we loved it. We loved it. Now get on to the real stuff.
Okay. Well, the real stuff is, back when I knew Amy, I had recently written my first book. This is not, by the way, a fake Zoom backdrop. This is actually first book. I hasn't been read. It's Corporate Views of the Public Interest. And it's really pathetic, as I think I still look like that. But this was a first systematic study of looking at corporate social performance. I know some of you on this call are somewhat skeptical of the social desirability of pushing some towards the quote unquote woke or ESG notions. This was well before ESG issues or some of the recent theoretically woke pressures. Is actually the guy who endorsed this, which you probably can't see, so I can make it up, is Reginald Jones, who was Jack Welch's predecessor at GE. He actually, this was back in 1980, 81, and this is way before I met Amy, way before, is coined the term corporate social responsibility. In fact, the Business Roundtable, as you probably saw 2 weeks ago, wrote a statement endorsing the purposes of a corporation that some in the Wall Street Journal have criticized, as they did 3 years ago when they issued the first version of it, and they just updated it a little bit, as if it was something new. In fact, it's not new. Just like we took a look at people who've made a cartoonish cliche out of Machiavelli, as you folks know, and we need to remind people more, Milton Friedman's been made into a cartoon caricature. He's not Frederick. He was not Frederick Hayek. He was not even quite Adam Smith, and certainly he was not Ayn Rand. But people create the same gestalt around this cluster. If you actually go back and read Milton Friedman's oft-quoted 1971, I think it was August, maybe August 21st, not somewhere around there, 1971 New York Times Magazine piece. He never said the only responsibility of business is the bottom line. He never said the bottom line in that whole piece anywhere. But he did say profits, but he didn't say the only. As in fact, if anybody can check me on this in your own free time, go to paragraph 26 in there. He called it social amenities. He said there are times where a corporation has, out of enlightened self-interest for the well-being of their shareholders, to consider the community impact and things like that, and in the long-term value of the corporation. And that's what we're talking about. Is so, and whether or not you agree on where that movement has gone, because that's what the Business Roundtable was founded to take a look at. The Cuyahoga River was on fire at that time when the Business Roundtable was created, and the toxic waste dumps and Love Canal, that of course were a product of Occidental Petroleum's Hooker Chemical division, and problems on the environmental side that Irving Shapiro actually led, the chairman of DuPont, who later succeeded Reginald Jones as chairman of the Business Roundtable, to take on the rest of the chemical industry and find a common ground for thoughtful environmental regulation. It wasn't climate change per se, but it was other kinds of regulation. And similarly, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act is Tom Phillips, who was the CEO of Raytheon, again, part of that founding generation of the Business Roundtable. And all these people were peers of the Queens, by the way, in terms of age, is that Tom Phillips created the Patriot missile system for Raytheon, a great engineer. And it was his belief that you can be an ethical defense company. And I shared that too, certain things they wouldn't do in terms of bio warfare and nukes and stuff. But anyhow, he came out with the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act because he thought he needed an equal playing field to compete against some of his competitors who were regularly, giving out bribes and doing other nasty things. And so we find across the board that generation had done some pretty powerful seminal things, and they were the same ones that led the pullout of South Africa in the apartheid years. This was the late 80s, toward the end of their reign. But before jumping to the mass exodus of companies, and they were a representation of it. It was 200 companies, particularly led by Coke, IBM, and General Motors. Is that, and that was, by the way, following the U.S. Senate, which overrode Ronald Reagan's veto, but it was Mitch McConnell who led the override. It was something like a 77-22 vote or something. Bob Dole and Mitch McConnell. They just said on this one case, the Gipper has it wrong, but it was important that it be private sector and public sector working in conjunction. So rocketing forward from getting involved back then, because in that reckless indiscretion of youth, when I was working at Harvard behind enemy lines, I wasn't actively encouraged to make this a front burner area of inquiry. It was considered somewhat periphery in academia, and maybe now some of it has gone too far and is loosely defined, and you almost need ESP to understand what's defined as ESG, and there are problems there. And I know this is not a call about ESG per se. However, looking at corporate social impact, I was, as a back burner area, as a separate line of inquiry, continuing doing research on that front and taking a look at whether or not it was on voting rights last year and their engagement in presidential succession issues, where the business community stepped up to the plate when people were frightened and confused after the election, and through the very awkward interregnum period at a minimum. Similarly, in being involved in taking a look at immigration reform issues, gun safety issues, how companies chose to engage. And I wasn't in a position of advocacy. I saw it as objective and partial research, but through it all, the companies that I looked at were none of them the first movers that we saw this February 24th. The first movers on February 24th, as you may know, were surprisingly big tech, big oil, and professional service firms. Well, no matter how you feel about all those other causes, you may like that some companies get involved, you may not like it, you may not care, but I think we'll share the observation that it's usually industries in fashion and retail and food and various consumer goods, ad agencies, that for either reasons of the value system of the enterprise or of the company, or for some greenwashing, perhaps more simplistic reasons, who knows why they do what they did. But it wasn't this time. This time, big tech, big oil, professional service firms. How surprising. Big tech, we know they've had issues with privacy and antitrust and hate speech promotion, where they've often been cast in a bad light. And big oil, of course, I think people are coming to realize that we can't end fossil fuels tomorrow, but still they've been in a negative light, and oligarchical entanglements. And then professional service firms, our friends of ours, who are those lawyers and accountants and consultants, would usually rather jump off a cliff than get involved in geopolitical controversy between clients. So that caught my attention. I went to talk to those 12 companies that were the first movers, just between we close friends, the CEOs of, well, I probably shouldn't name them, but you know who they are. And they told me that what they were most concerned about wasn't their board's support, that their boards were with them. Most of them conferred with the boards before they acted, but it was surprising that they were most worried about a lot of pretenders. That you have people in any one of those good causes I talked about, if you even consider them noble causes, let's say voting rights, you have a lot of people who hijack these issues. I worked with President Bush 41 on the cancer front, trying to get together all these different cancer fighting organizations for something called, at that time, the National Dialogue on Cancer, became called Sea Change. We couldn't keep up with all the organizations, look-alike organizations, who were trying to hijack the noble cause of battling cancer, that were siphoning off funds. And it was like that with voting rights. Before last year's voter access controversies, there are about 35 organizations historically working on that front, and another seemingly credible 10 that joined. There are 320 of them now. And many of them, I can sing in the list of them with, and their descriptions very much look alike names and things. And this was starting to happen on this front too, with the whole Russia thing. There are some companies that brand themselves as being social impact oriented, and I think there's some of them are just commercial ventures. There are literally 2,000 ESG funds out there, believe it or not. Yeah, there are fewer than 5,000 publicly listed companies, but 2,000 ESG funds if you count the REITs and alternative asset funds and things. I mean, really, 2,000? So who's jumped into this cause where people that were whitewashing or greenwashing or whatever it was were celebrating companies that hadn't done anything, and the CEOs were the bold first movers? Well, I'll name some. BP, they wrote down $9 billion. They weren't happy that some good guy, group that has these big tuxedo gala events where people put on bow ties and give $1.50 and then go back to doing their evil deeds, feel so good about it, are blessing companies that haven't done anything because they merely said their hearts and minds are with the Ukrainian people. I said, whoa, so I need to take a look at this. So I went in then on the 24th, and I started to separate out the real things from the pretenders. And on March 4th, a few days later, I went on CNBC with that list and put out an article simultaneously in Fortune. I'm a Fortune columnist. And you didn't need complex statistical gymnastics to draw the right inference of what cause and effect was. Is to the second, when the companies were listed on, you can see it on CNBC, it's published, and we actually now have the analysis at an SSRN site. If you go to it, you can see we've actually studied 1,300 companies and time series data. When their announcement went out, what happened to their market value? So in fact, it didn't cost Occidental or BP $9 billion or Exxon $5 billion or $4 billion for Shell to write off their assets. Their market value soared when the announcement came out. And it's, by the way, you say, oh, energy industry, everybody benefit. No, you could take a look at Total Energy, the French company now, they have suffered miserably. And companies who stayed in were not doing well. So we thought what we needed to do is to try to keep up with very clever public relations spin, which came along, where they're creating smokescreen that was blurring the issues. There are some companies that were saying, well, we're going to forestall future investment. Well, that's not actually an exit, but I couldn't legally say they were digging in and continuing along unabated. And we got many legal threats, about 22 or 23 of them, largely European, but a few from the US. And Yale's general counsel never got nervous, amazingly. We did, but we didn't tell them we did. But we always had the facts on our side. I had 42 researchers working with me, many people on the ground with mastery at a native level, because many of them were natives from these countries. We have people, and still do, people from Moldova and Uzbekistan, Belarus, in Moscow, in real time, taking photographs, pictures, videos, purchasing things to actually show when I needed receipts and needed transactions to show what you say is not true. Here it is. But also, of course, in Poland and Germany, but with 10 languages, econometric expertise, political scientists, people who are experts in corporate governance, and different industry analysts, calibrating these companies. So we came up with an A through F list. And that's the status of where things are on that list now, Amy, is we have classified these companies where there was initially a huge bulge in the F category. There's been a continual migration from the F to the A's. No companies reverted overtly. Some of them seem to lose a little ground, but there's some companies that were Fs, candidly, like that you were surprisingly like McDonald's. Now, I shouldn't name names of a naive journalist since we're public, and some of you probably like Tom Friedman, so I won't mention his name. But of the many naive things that he writes once or twice a week, it was something which I think that turned the stomachs of many of you as professionals in this field. The Golden Arches rule of democracy, of diplomacy rather, that of course was not true when he authored it at the time in the Middle East, which he did know, Asia, which he didn't know, and Central Europe, which he should have known. And many of you know that it wasn't true then, that any two countries with the McDonald's would never go to war with each other. Is we look at the meltdown Serbo-Croatia, that had nothing to do with lack of casual dining, and it's not true of everywhere else too. And if it meant it just as a metaphor, but looking at specifically with 870 McDonald's in Russia and 130 of them in Ukraine, that wasn't the problem. And even more so in McDonald's case, there wasn't the easy barrier of saying, well, I have complex franchise vendor relations. I can't get it. They owned most of the restaurants themselves. They could have turned off the spigot. A very good guy at the helm, Chris Kopensky, was new to the job. He'd had some other foot faults learning how to lead. I admire him enormously. And they realized they were on the wrong course. And I give them tremendous credit for reversing course. Their example of a company went from an F to a B to an A and shutting down all their operations. And they're one of the very few companies that had significant top line revenues from Russia. Most of these companies, almost all of them had fewer than 2%. And in fact, most of them fewer than 1% of their global revenues and less in terms of their profits. Russia's not McDonald's had about 10%. But there are a lot of companies who made that move. But consumer goods companies, they were all back there. Right now, the only ones left are Giorgio Armani. Lord knows why they're there. Benetton, TGI Fridays, very few of them are still down there in the F category, but the A's pulled out completely and permanently. The B's pulled out temporarily. They were suspended things. The C's were people who pulled out partially. Sadly, PepsiCo didn't pull out of there. And we're very close to Pepsi at Yale. Ingenuity is one of our great alums, and the dairy company that she bought, her successor kept open for now. And so they're a C. A D are the companies that we think was a bit of a scam, but we legally had to recognize. They're the companies that were putting off some illusory future investments they had never announced before. We don't know where, when, how much, but they did at least acknowledge there's a war. They're doing something. And the F companies, like the fashion companies that I mentioned, food companies I mentioned, or Huntsman Chemical, bewilderingly, as many of you know, John Huntsman, that his with everything he stood for, that his brother would keep them digging in Russia. It must be an amazing Thanksgiving dinner table coming up there. And then International Paper and some others that were surprised are there. But what we found, by geography, it didn't really matter in terms of financial performance. Size didn't matter, even public or private, as we looked at how debt was being evaluated. So that was where things were. And we thought, finally, we're done. We can move on to other things. Then we see Putin coming along, misstating. Those companies didn't leave. So we had to go through a lot of verification that, in fact, of the 1,300 multinationals we tracked, which is historic, has never been like anything like that. South Africa, it was 200. As we mentioned, this was 1,200 of them. Well, actually, 1,100 have absolutely pulled, and they're still classified. You can see it on either our website or SSRN. Is then Putin saying, okay, they pulled out, but it didn't matter. And we see him putting out two numbers that were false. His GDP, which is a sheer invention. There's nothing anybody on this call can show me that will support the GDP number that he created by fiat, or the ruble, which again is dictated by fiat. It's not a traded currency after the outbreak of war. Most political writers and most economic writers didn't realize that. And frankly, most macroeconomists, including at the IMF, Treasury, State Department, and the Prime Minister's cabinet, which we just addressed last week in the UK, they acknowledge it now. But people were bewildered. They're confused. How could he have had this resilience? He didn't have this resilience. And in fact, but he suppressed 60 key indices. In fact, 30 absolutely fundamental benchmarks that you need to have to be an IMF member. IMF didn't even realize Putin stopped contributing that core data to justify it. It's things like trade numbers. You don't know how much they what their exports or imports are, or foreign direct investment. These are like basics and things that they were concealing. The key indices, key sectors. Now he did release that for Q1, and every sector, as you'll see on an SSRN paper we have on this, which as we're on the phone now, I just see we crossed the $90,000 number. I wish it was dollar number threshold, and some 320,000 downloads, which is, pretty good for 3 weeks. It's SSRN tells us it's set a record forever what that's worth. But we haven't had a single. You could go to my Twitter feed, which you can't edit. There's not a single negative comment from anybody there. Sometimes I'm afraid to take my research before my own colleagues at Yale at one of our lunchtime seminars, who are always out to gainsay and grandstand at each other's expense. And I go on CNBC with the wrong tie. Somebody will tell me because I'm colorblind. Nobody's criticized this data that's up there, and no matter what incentives they've had. And I don't think you would immodestly would be able to either, is wherever Russia was the seller, we went to the buyer. Wherever Russia was the buyer, we went to the seller reciprocally, or we went to third parties that also gathered trade data and stuff. Or some companies, countries that had, even China had surprisingly transparent data showing that even they had greater than a 50% reduction in their imports of vital industrial equipment into Russia. As you saw this week, they couldn't buy weapons.
Jeff, I just want to interject because this is wonderful, but I want to make sure we get a chance to get others into the conversation and have a chance for them to ask their questions.
I'll stop there. Fire away.
All right, great. Why don't I jump in just with a quick question? I'll turn it over to John Taylor, and then please use your raise hand function if you want to get in the queue. So you've talked a lot about fascinating data about countries that have been withdrawing from Russia. And of course, the political scientist wants to know why. Is there something systematic that's driving these decisions, or is the variable really individual leadership? So let me get at that by posing a hypothetical, which is China blockades or invades Taiwan. What companies or industries, based on what you've seen in Russia's invasion of Ukraine, what companies or industries would you expect to pull out of China first, and why?
Now that's a really hard one, and it is a completely different situation, which we need to talk about. And I just had this discussion on campus last week, at the end of the week, because I brought some of my Yale colleagues into Treasury with me for a discussion about why oil caps will work, despite the fact that it challenges economic orthodoxy on cartels succeeding. And that's because you have to take a look at the marketplace specifics. And they wanted to talk about Pareto optimality. I said, no, you got to take a look at what the situation is on energy. Forget Pareto for now. And we can talk about that, such as the lack of fungibility of gas that Putin lies and says we can send it to Asia. They can't. They don't have the pipelines for that vapor. It's not liquefied. And oil, they're actually at break-even level in selling oil because India and Russia have gotten such big discounts, and they're very inefficient producer. So you have to look at the specifics before you buy the propaganda. When you get to China, it's a very different situation because Russia brings nothing to the global marketplace other than the raw materials of a vassal state as a colony in a mercantile system. It is a couple of rare of rare metals that aren't that rare, that's titanium and other things we can duplicate with a little short transition elsewhere. It's mainly grain and it's food and fuel. Everything else, there's no value added. So Russia is not a big deal to turn that spigot off. And plus, Russia can't afford to turn that spigot off. Is the only revenues they're bringing in. 65% of their economy is coming from those commodities we're talking about. So they have to sell them more than we need to buy them. So as the buyers, we have the power in that case. That's not the case with China, but the market power is with the buyers. It's a buyer's market, not a seller's market, the way Putin pretends. And his war of attrition is that he can confuse journalists into thinking it's a seller's market and will break down the unity in the EU or elsewhere. So far it's holding because a lot of us are trying to check his propaganda. But when it comes to China, what do we have to look at there? Is that since the time I've been at Yale, which I've been at Yale 20 years, we went from them being very dependent on us for microprocessors to now, of course, us depending on them for chips. And you can say, well, it's Taiwan. Well, Taiwan Semiconductor and others have a lot of Fungen Industries and others where they're actually producing it, no matter who owns it, in mainland China. And regardless, you're talking about Taiwan being the target. That means regardless of how you classify Taiwan or mainland China, we're putting both in peril. We can't survive very long making bellicose decisions about that. And we also just since the time I've been at Yale also, which is again just 20 years, I got here, there were 7 antibiotic manufacturers here. Cipro was invented right down the street from me here, and it was manufactured almost totally here in was American Home Products. It later became Bayer, but it's gone, shut down. Yale bought it as our West campus now because they have 20-foot high hoods and things. We don't, and all it's manufactured in China. There are various explanations as to why it migrated there. We don't have antibiotics here. We have an awful lot of dependencies in the ecosystem that goes with us. So it's a problem. The country's second, well, I shouldn't mention the number, or a very big shoemaker in this country said that I was a VP at the time we pulled out of New England and Maine and moved down to the Carolinas. And then I became president. We moved into Brazil. It was my decision. We moved out of Brazil and moved into China as I was CEO. And now we're trying to ramp up in Vietnam and pull out of China. And the Chinese just told us, oh, no, you don't. Unless you shut down Vietnam right away, you're out of business. There's no transition time. As he realized, I am just I'm the market, the U.S. marketing arm for a Chinese company, that the transition time and now the shoes aren't so important, but to the shareholders they are, but we are very dependent in a lot of ways in China. However, what happened when we look at Xinjiang province just, before the Olympics, a year ago, May, every fashion company, some aggressively and some reluctantly, pulled out of Xinjiang province for that really beautiful fine cotton, which is allegedly produced through forced labor for the oppression of the Uyghurs. They did all pull out of there, but that was industry specific. When people went after beverage companies and others to be supportive, they didn't and couldn't. So I think it's going to take a lot more sophistication dealing with China because of its centrality in a lot of markets. And frankly, I think China is going to be a lot more savvy. Xi Jinping realizes that he needs Russian resources, but he's better off without Putin. Don't think anything different. Last week, as you probably saw, 3 top scientists were imprisoned by Putin as he identified them as spies for China. There are a lot of things that are going wrong between Russia and China from their standpoint that are good for us. So I think that China, despite Xi Jinping's his own re-election issues, is a lot more savvy about recognizing that we are roughly 8 times the market, but just the U.S. alone, 8 times the market that Russia is to them, not to mention the rest of the world. They need us. So hopefully we're going to work this out with China differently than what was brewing, especially around the time of Pelosi's visit.
Thanks, Jeff. Let me turn over to John Taylor. And then just so you know, in the queue, we have Ann Clunan and then Rose Gadamuller. And please, when you ask a question, please introduce yourself so everybody knows.
Yeah, let me very, very quick. Thank you so much, Jeff. One of the things which makes me wonder is what's happening at the public sector level. We don't hear much about this. The IMF has not been out there. The US government has not been out there. You have a change in the government in the UK. Is there some hope there that some of the things you're saying will be brought? It's like almost free markets versus capitalism versus socialism. Anything else that could be done along those lines?
I actually think that Russia is getting some cash right now from energy. The fear that's being marketed into Europe right now about a cold winter is exaggerated. It's the old Mark Twain exaggerating reports of my death. Is they're not going to have a cold winter. It's going to be an expensive winter, though. Is they have all the gas they need is already right now as we're speaking. The gas in Europe is at 85% winter storage capacity, which is 20% more than it was this time last year. And even though Nord Stream has been shut down, Nord Stream is only less than a third of the pipelines from Russia into Europe. And if they shut down the others, by the way, they can survive. Right now, just since the outbreak of war, into Germany alone, but or the EU in general, Russia was supplying about 43% of the EU's gas. Now it's less than 10%. It's about 43% just from the US alone. Then you add Norway on top of it, it's pretty impressive. But people are doing a lot of anxiety selling. Sometimes people in industry, sometimes people are unwitting idiots of Putin in the European media by saying these things that are wrong, which is that that we have a crisis coming. Is the European leaders, especially Germany, is amazing. I mean, from my standpoint, I think it's a shame they shut down nuclear reactors, but they did start ramping up with 6 mega conversion plants so that they will be able to take liquefied natural gas in about 2 months, because they started the construction right away of 6 major conversion. So this LNG can come in from Algeria, come in the whole rest of the world. And also to your point, which is a good question, to the amazement of many political scientists, not to mention journalists, is just 2 weeks ago, Wednesday, when the EU came out with a 15% voluntary, like wartime rationing. I mean, they may not need it, but Spain and Portugal don't get any energy from Russia, and yet they went along with it. And who would have thought that Turkey and Hungary would go along with this? But they did, and that's very encouraging. So they have plenty in storage now. They have plenty of new sources from us, and they'll have many for later. So I think that Putin is not succeeding in breaking the resolve on that front, even though we have changing leadership in all these places. And Marie Le Pen did better than many wanted. We have, uncertain leadership in many other places right now, and changes here, who knows what. So I think it's a great question, but actually, despite all the lack of pillars of stable leadership, symbolically represented by the loss of the Queen today, is that in fact that Putin's message is not working on that front, but he's trying something different that I'm seeing in a lot of the European press in the last 3 days, is coming out with fake polls that are suggesting a lack of European unity. Now, if you look at who those pollsters are that some journalists are using, I'm going back. I just did it with Deutsche Welle. I said, have you ever heard of them? Where are they? They're Potemkin Village creations of pollsters, but they're putting in false information that only 40% of the German public is in favor of Ukraine. Well, it's not true, but he's trying to weaken it that way. If that doesn't work, a thing that our sources tell us he has planned for next week, we'll see if this is true, is that there is a water shortage somewhat in Europe, massively in China, and devastating in Africa. It's at 50-year, if not maybe even 70-year drought conditions, horrible. The milestone is so bad. That could create famine, which is horrible, but he's going to try to suggest this is somehow Ukraine's fault. In fact, there are bumper crops. If the rains will continue right now, is Ukraine's production, to the shock even of President Zelensky, who is predicting about 45 billion cubic metrics of grain, which is standard where they come in, despite the shelling of seeding and harvesting and logistics and storage and ports. They have a bumper crop. They're going to approach Russia at around 70 billion cubic metrics, which is amazing. There's plenty of grain. The hard part is distribution for the rest of the world, but Putin's going to try to break the resolve that way. So your question is a good one. I worry because he keeps trying to throw other stones to break the glass of unity.
So I saw, Jeff, as you were talking, Rose Gottemoeller nodding, and for those of you who don't know, Rose, former Deputy Secretary General of NATO, I'm sure she has a few things to say about the European perspective. What I'd like to do in the interest of time, I'm mindful we have 9 minutes left. Rose, let me have you ask your question, and we'll go to you to ask your question, and then Jeff, you can address both of them. Rose, over to you.
Thank you so very much, Amy. And Jeff, I just want to say I have been eating up everything that you've been writing. I am not an economist myself, but I'm glad that somebody finally spoke up and said these numbers cannot be right, because I just instinctively didn't think they were right. I wanted to ask you if you could comment on the role of the central bank. You have commented on it in writing, but I've been amazed that Elvira Nabiulina has been able to hang on somehow. I know she was not allowed
Rose,
to design.
we're having some trouble with your feed. It's hard to hear you.
Oh dear. All right. I'm going to put my question in the chat. My question is about the role of the central bank. If you could talk to that.
The question, I heard the compliments crystal clear, which was most important of all. And it was the hardball question. It was about something bank, which is the World Bank?
No, the central bank.
Oh, Central Bank of Russia. Do you know that, and I can send you this, you might be curious to know, guess who the number one, so because with SSRN, They have great metrics. They can take a look at who's downloading our paper. They are the #1 reader of our paper, is the central bank. And what we can see is we're having trouble figuring out what's going on in the central bank. As you know better than I, they're widely admired. Rostat is something different. Rostat, which actually producing the numbers, they've had a complete changeover. They fired the chief economist there and all of his top staff, and they've done that before. Just like we used to joke about 5-year plans in Russia in the bad old days in the Soviet era, is they regularly keep revising their GDP numbers and how they're put together. So we don't know what's happening there, but the bank itself is it's the smartest people, and he's not changed that out. But there's something which I don't know how they got it. But Bloomberg just came out with something you may have seen 2 days ago. I had nothing to do with it. I'm just reading it a third hand or second hand like the rest of us. Bloomberg got leaked information from Russia's central bank. The things are every bit as bad as we said they are. And Putin has wanted them to get the honest information because up until that moment, he thought it wouldn't leak.
Anne, over to you.
Hi, I'm Ann Clunan. I'm a professor at the Naval Postgraduate School. Jeff, thanks so much for your report. It was, something that I very much welcomed. Like you, I'm part of the McFall-Yermak group, and we're working pretty hard on the sanctions effectiveness paper right now. And so one of the concerns is that the data that you've gathered isn't replicable or rigorous enough. And that has been charges that we've heard not just from the Russian side, but some other economists who are wondering if it's credible to sort of just take the rosy view that you've taken. And I know that I'm not talking about pundits in the press, which I agree with you. I think that the Russian economy is in deep, deep trouble. But what I'm particularly concerned about is if there is any way to get some granular information about third parties who are still selling to Russia, right? And taking out the electronic components, for example, that they're using in their weapon systems and things like that.
Well, first of all, it could only be Russian sources or naive macroeconomists that have believed Russian sources, because there's not a single person that anybody on this call, and including you or anybody in Naval Academy, can name that says there's a single statistic that isn't accurate or verifiable. We have sourced everything that's on. It's 118 pages there. We have sourced every bit of it. So anybody can find what it is. I can tell you right now how many planes Russia has in storage at S7 versus Aeroflot and what their flights are. And we know, and we've put out there in subsequent work, it was in Fortune last week, that there are some parts slipping in. There's as you on the McFall group, and we know there's always going to be some slippage, some cheating. We don't know for sure it's coming through Turkey or wherever, but we're talking about ways that you identify surge orders for aviation parts. Boeing insists it's not them, but kind of hints it's Airbus. Airbus is buying titanium from Russia, but they're not doing it secretly. But Airbus is not supporting the sanctions as much as Boeing is. But even Boeing parts are accessible because Aeroflot has more planes in the sky than they should right now. Happily, Reuters and others are saying, oh, that's because they're harvesting planes that they've mothballed. I wish that was the case because I want to support sanctions working, but it's not. Something is leaking in there in terms of aviation parts, but most industrial parts you can't get, and not enough aviation. We can see it's grinding to a halt. For example, this is why you saw Russia sue Exxon last week for getting out of the Arctic deal. They need all the parts, know-how, technology. They can't mine their Arctic holdings without U.S. technology, U.S. know-how, and that's. So there's zero evidence, and there isn't a single person. If you go to the website, go to the Twitter feed, there's 7 Nobel Prize winners have weighed in how accurate this is. Every Russian industry analyst and energy analyst has weighed in on it. So there's the data. It's not a question of it being replicable. This is objective third-party data. If China says we're not, if there's nobody that we know that drives a Russian car outside of Russia, and very few people in Russia, style, safety, quality, whatever. However, what do people drive in Russia is non-Russian cars. So we went to all the automakers and we put out there who said what, is that 95% of car sales are down in Russia. 95%. It's easily replicable. Anybody else could do the same survey of these companies, and we named it. It's just it's just not there. The only thing that's being sold is inventory that's already on the lots and Russian dealers. So it's all there. There's nothing that can't be verified, sourced, and supported. You know,
So-
you see a critic comes up in a lot of stories, an economist with an English name. It turns out that person, I won't bother to use his name, appears in every story as the economic critic of our data. He's never suggested anything that's wrong with the data. And you look at his background, who is he? He's the chief strategist for Sberbank and Alpha Bank. Yeah, he's not exactly an independent analyst, even if he has a Western name.
So we have time for one last, this is our lightning round. So I'm going to go to Anatol to ask the question quickly. And then Jeff, you've got about 2 minutes to answer before we sign off. Anatol, over to you.
Yeah, hi, thank you. I'm Anatol Shmelev. I'm the Russian curator for the Hoover Institution. I've been doing quite a bit of collecting in the Russian Federation, especially before the war broke out. And one of my big projects before the war was to work together with Memorial, which was an organization, NGO, that was under attack by the Putin government. And we were supposed to transfer money to them for a big digitization project for their archives. But then the war broke out, sanctions, we couldn't get any money to them. And so my question really is, what can we do to support these types of organizations in Russia, opposition organizations and so on and so forth, if we can't get any funds to them and we can't help them in any way because of the sanctions?
Anatol, that is really hard. And unfortunately, with the political scientists here on the call, you know that another one of the cliches, which is a false cliche, is that economic embargoes don't work. Look at the disappointments in Cuba, North Korea, Iran. Okay, we keep recycling the same disappointments. We forget that economic blockades, when they're universal, and yes, cultural institutions sadly suffer. Museums and ballet suffer. And there shouldn't even be humanitarian exemptions. I'm that much of a purist on this, is that the total society has to be taken on. Is that you either, this work with Nicolae Ceausescu in Romania, work with Eric Honecker, relatively, 90 people died total. And who would have thought that would have happened in East Germany and Jaruzelski in Poland, to other parts of the world. Independent of Arab Spring, it was an economic boycott that took down Gaddafi in Libya. And similarly, if you look at Chile with Pinochet or Argentina, it was private sector and public together that labeled it. And as Bishop Tutu told me, what was important was the symbolism and substance together that to the Afrikaners labeled them as a rogue nation, where it finally broke through, is this mattered. And of course, Gandhi would stop ambulances on the way to the hospital. It seems awful, but you either have a complete breakdown in civil society, or else you have warfare, or else you have appeasement. That's the spectrum. Do we have Neville Chamberlain-like appeasement with what any military expert on this call would tell us is the most dangerous person who ever walked the planet, more than Genghis Khan, Adolf Hitler, or Attila the Hun, because they didn't have access to thermonuclear weapons, and he's got 6,000 of them pointed at us right now, and is quite bellicose about it? Or do you go to the other, and we don't trigger thermonuclear war. We don't want appeasement. An economic blockade is the rational, peaceful alternative, and it means cultural institutions and clinical trials for drugs get put on hold. Right now, you remember Hitler's Willing Executioners by Jacob Goldhammer. I know it's somewhat controversial to the experts, but everybody else in his field agrees with it. They just didn't like the way he characterized their own work in the field. But is that holding the German population responsible through their complicity, they're complicit through their complacency. Only 4% of Russians download a VPN, and 70% of them are tech savvy enough that they could. They know that Anatoly Navalny is in prison. Any opposition have been killed, and there's no alternative media. They know that. They know that direct relatives, close kin, are telling them what's going on. They don't want to hear it. Is that we have to hold Russian people responsible for now until there's more anger on the streets. But there are tipping points in every country. Russia knows how to suffer better, perhaps, in some countries. They all have a tipping point. And when a bloody, ruthless tyrant reigns with these mass slaughters, if you don't want to take him on in a bloody warfare, then you have to show that he is not the effective totalitarian that he says he is, and that a civil society stands up on him and he be seen as the enemy of the people himself. That's when he gets taken down.
Well, on that cheerful note, Jeff, we've come to the end of our session. Please join me, everyone, in thanking Professor Jeff Sonnenfeld from Yale for a very stimulating conversation. Thank you so much, everyone, for being with us. Let me remind you, we have an ongoing series for the TAG, so please check our website. We have more events every month. So thanks, everybody, and we'll see you online or in person next time.
Thank you. I'm so honored. Thank you.